The punch landed hard, right between her ribs. Lieutenant Commander Derek Sullivan stood over the young medic, his face twisted with rage, expecting her to crumple. Instead, Irene Hill straightened slowly, her hazel eyes meeting his with a calm that made his blood run cold. "You just made," she said quietly, her European accent cutting through the tension like a blade, "the biggest mistake of your military career." What Sullivan didn't know, what nobody on that base knew, was that the 26-year-old medic he'd just assaulted wasn't just any medical officer. 6 seconds later, when Admiral Catherine Reeves walked into that medical bay and saluted the woman on the floor, everything Sullivan thought he knew about rank, respect, and who held real power was about to shatter. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more inspiring stories. The Mediterranean sun beat down on naval support activity Naples with relentless intensity, turning the concrete of the medical facility into a griddle. Inside the air-conditioned sanctuary of Building 7, Lieutenant Irene Hill adjusted her stethoscope and prepared for another day of being invisible. At 26, Irene had learned that being underestimated was both a curse and a strategic advantage. Standing 5'3" with a slight build and delicate features that made her look barely old enough to vote, she'd spent the last 8 months at Naples watching career officers dismiss her with a glance. Her Italian mother's genetics had given her olive skin and dark curls that refused to stay properly pinned beneath her cap. Her Norwegian father's contribution was the steel in her spine that nobody bothered to notice. The medical bay hummed with its usual morning rhythm, computers chirping, autoclave hissing, the distant sound of morning formation echoing across the base. Irene moved through her pre-shift routine with practiced efficiency, checking supply levels and reviewing the night shift's patient logs. She'd been assigned to routine medical care, physicals, minor injuries, prescription refills. The kind of work that kept her safely away from anything that might be considered challenging or important. Her colleagues treated her with polite condescension. Dr. Raymond Foster, the senior medical officer, had a habit of explaining basic procedures to her as if she hadn't graduated top of her class from one of Europe's most prestigious military medical programs. The nurses, mostly career petty officers with decades of experience, smiled at her suggestions and then quietly did things their own way. "Hill," Foster called from his office, his Alabama drawl stretching her surname into 2 syllables. "I need you to handle sick call this morning. Nothing complicated, just the usual malingerers trying to get out of PT." Irene nodded, swallowing the familiar taste of dismissal. Sick call was the medical equivalent of traffic duty, necessary but mind-numbing work that required minimal skill and offered zero opportunity to demonstrate competence. It was where they put the medics they didn't trust with real medicine. The first patients were exactly as Foster had predicted, a sailor with a suspiciously timed stomachache scheduled for the same time as a major training exercise, a petty officer with a headache that would miraculously disappear once he received his quarters slip, a lance corporal with a sprained ankle that showed no swelling or discoloration. Irene processed them all with efficiency and quiet competence, making notes in their files and offering advice they probably wouldn't follow. She'd learned not to push too hard, not to demonstrate too much knowledge. The one time she diagnosed a subtle case of compartment syndrome that Foster had missed, he'd spent the next week finding fault with everything she did. Lieutenant Commander Derek Sullivan arrived at 0930, and Irene knew immediately that he was going to be a problem. She'd seen his type before, career officer, mid-30s, the kind of man who wore his rank like armor and treated anyone below his pay grade as either servants or obstacles. He was built like someone who'd played football in college and never quite let go of that glory, broad shoulders, thick neck, the swagger of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "I need to see the real doctor," Sullivan announced, not even looking at Irene as she approached with his chart. "I'm Lieutenant Hill, sir. I'll be handling your appointment today." "What brings you in?" Sullivan finally looked at her, his pale blue eyes sweeping over her with the kind of dismissive assessment she'd endured countless times. "I said I need to see the actual doctor. Not some kid playing nurse." Irene kept her expression neutral, though she felt the familiar heat rising in her chest. "Dr. Foster is currently with another patient, sir." I'm fully qualified to address your medical concerns. According to your chart, you're here for a follow-up on your shoulder injury? Listen, sweetheart, Sullivan said, his condescending smile making her want to throw her clipboard at his head. I'm sure you're very good at taking temperatures and handing out aspirin. But I've got a legitimate issue that requires actual medical expertise. So why don't you be a good girl and go get someone who knows what they're doing? The medical bay had gone quiet. Irene was aware of the nurses pausing in their work, of the other patients watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. This was a test, she realized. Not just of her patience, but of her willingness to accept her place in the hierarchy. She could call Foster. Could defer to Sullivan's demands and reinforce his assumption that she was incapable. Or she could do her job. Sir, with respect, I am someone who knows what they're doing. I've reviewed your file. You sustained a rotator cuff injury during a training exercise 6 weeks ago. You've completed physical therapy, and today's appointment is to evaluate whether you're ready to return to full duty. Now, if you'll have a seat on the examination table, I'll conduct the necessary assessments. Sullivan's expression darkened. He took a step toward her, using his 6'2" frame to its full intimidating potential. You've got a mouth on you for someone so junior. I don't know how they do things in whatever third-rate European military you came from, but here in the real Navy, we show respect to our superiors. I am showing respect, sir, Irene replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now flooding her system. I'm respecting your time by offering to conduct your examination efficiently. I'm respecting the other patients waiting by not delaying your appointment. And I'm respecting my oath as a medical officer by insisting on providing you with proper care, regardless of your personal preferences about who delivers it. For a moment, she thought he might actually back down. Then she saw something shift in his eyes, a calculation, a decision. Sullivan had realized that she wasn't going to fold, and that her defiance in front of witnesses was a challenge to his authority that he couldn't let stand. You know what your problem is, Hill? Sullivan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You don't know your place. Someone needs to teach you that there are consequences for disrespect. Irene saw the punch coming a fraction of a second before it landed. Years of training screamed at her to move, to block, to counter. But she was in uniform, on a military base, facing a superior officer. Defending herself would only make things worse. So she did the hardest thing she'd ever done. She stood still and took it. The fist caught her right between the ribs, driving the air from her lungs and sending a spike of pain through her torso. Irene stumbled back, catching herself against the examination table. The medical bay erupted in chaos, nurses rushing forward, patients standing up, someone shouting for security. Through the ringing in her ears, Irene heard Sullivan's voice, confident and dismissive. Maybe now you'll learn to show proper respect to your superiors, Lieutenant. She straightened slowly, one hand pressed against her ribs, and met Sullivan's eyes. In that moment, a decision crystallized. She'd spent 8 months being careful, being small, keeping secrets that could change everything. But some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. You just made, Irene said quietly, her slight European accent more pronounced through the pain, the biggest mistake of your military career. Sullivan laughed. Is that a threat, sweetheart? Because I don't think you understand how this works. The door to the medical bay burst open. Admiral Catherine Reeves, commander of all naval special warfare operations in the European theater, strode in with the kind of presence that made everyone in the room snap to attention. Everyone except Irene, who remained leaning against the examination table, and Sullivan, who was still processing the appearance of a 2-star admiral in what should have been a routine medical appointment. What happened in the next 6 seconds would become legend throughout the naval base, repeated in mess halls and barracks for years to come. Admiral Reeves took in the scene with the kind of tactical assessment that came from 30 years of military service. Her eyes moved from Sullivan to Irene to the shocked faces of the medical staff. Then she did something that made Derek Sullivan's face drain of all color. Admiral Catherine Reeves came to attention and saluted the young medic everyone had dismissed as insignificant. The silence in the medical bay was absolute. Even the computers seemed to have stopped chirping. Derek Sullivan stood frozen, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing, a two-star admiral saluting a junior medical officer. It violated everything he understood about military hierarchy, about the natural order of things. Irene Hill straightened despite the pain in her ribs and returned the salute with crisp precision. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Gone was the accommodating tone she'd used for 8 months. What remained was something else entirely, the voice of someone who'd been playing a role and had just decided the performance was over. "Admiral Reeves," Irene said. "I apologize for the disturbance. The situation is under control." "With respect, Admiral Hill," Reeves replied, and Sullivan felt his knees go weak at those 2 words, Admiral Hill. "The situation appears to be anything but under control. Would you care to explain why you're holding your ribs?" The medical bay had erupted in confused whispers. "Admiral Hill?" The quiet medic who processed sick call and took orders from everyone. Nurses who dismissed her suggestions for months stared in shock. Dr. Foster appeared in his office doorway, his face pale. And Derek Sullivan stood in the center of it all, watching his career implode in real time. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan disagreed with my medical assessment," Irene said carefully. He expressed his disagreement physically. Reeves' expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went cold. "Lieutenant Commander, I'm going to give you one opportunity to explain yourself. And I suggest you choose your words very carefully." Sullivan's mouth opened and closed. His mind raced through possible explanations, justifications, anything that might salvage this situation. But what could he say? That he'd punched a superior officer because she'd insisted on doing her job? That he'd assaulted a flag officer because he'd assumed her rank and gender made her inferior? I didn't know," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't know what?" Reeves asked, her tone dangerously soft. "I didn't know she was an admiral." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? He hadn't known Irene's real rank, so he'd assumed he could treat her however he wanted. The implicit confession in those 4 words, that he might not have assaulted her if he'd known she outranked him, made everything worse. Irene spoke before Reeves could respond. "Admiral Reeves, if I might address this situation?" At Reeves' nod, she turned to Sullivan. Her hazel eyes, which had seemed so soft and accommodating for months, now held something that made him want to look away. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, you are correct. You didn't know. You didn't know that I'm actually Rear Admiral Irene Hill, commander of Naval Special Warfare Group 2. You didn't know that I graduated from the Norwegian Naval Academy first in my class. You didn't know that I've completed 3 deployments with SEAL teams, or that I hold advanced medical qualifications in battlefield trauma care." She paused, and the pain in her ribs made her wince, but she didn't stop. "But here's what troubles me, Lieutenant Commander. You also didn't know that the medic you assaulted might have been a single mother working 2 jobs to support her children. You didn't know she might have been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who mattered. You struck me because you believed I was junior to you, because you believed I was insignificant. And that, sir, is a far more serious problem than simply not recognizing a superior officer." The medical base staff had gone from shocked to stunned. Rear Admiral? SEAL teams? Every interaction they'd had with her for 8 months replayed in their minds with new context. The times she'd quietly corrected procedures. The moments she'd suggested alternative treatments. The way she'd handled emergency situations with a calm that had seemed almost supernatural. Dr. Foster looked like he might be sick. He'd spent months mansplaining basic medicine to someone who'd probably forgotten more about trauma care than he'd ever learned. "Master-at-Arms," Reeves called toward the security personnel who'd arrived during the confrontation. "Please escort Lieutenant Commander Sullivan to the base commander's office. Inform Captain Rodriguez that we have a situation requiring immediate attention. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan is to be placed on administrative hold pending formal charges." As the security personnel moved to flank Sullivan, Irene held up a hand. "If I might make a request, Admiral Reeves?" Of course, Admiral Hill. I'd like 48 hours before formal charges are filed. I'd like the opportunity to speak with Lieutenant Commander Sullivan privately, to understand what led to this incident. Reeves studied her for a long moment. You're showing him more courtesy than he showed you. I'm showing him the courtesy every service member deserves, the opportunity to be heard and understood. Even when they've made a terrible mistake. It was a masterclass in leadership, Sullivan realized through his shock and horror. Irene Hill, Admiral Hill, was demonstrating more grace and professionalism in the aftermath of being assaulted than he'd shown during his entire career. She was teaching without saying the words, this is what actual strength looks like. This is what real authority commands. Very well, Reeves agreed. 48 hours. But Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, understand this, Admiral Hill is offering you a kindness you don't deserve. I suggest you use this time wisely. She turned back to Irene, her expression softening slightly. Admiral, I recommend you have those ribs examined by Dr. Foster. And I'll expect a full report on your desk by end of day tomorrow. After Reeves left, the medical bay remained eerily quiet. Irene finally straightened fully, wincing at the pain in her side. She looked around at the staff who'd dismissed her for months, at the patients who'd watched the entire confrontation, and at Sullivan, who stood between two security guards looking like a man whose entire world had just collapsed. Well, she said, and there was something almost sad in her voice. I suppose my cover is blown. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The examination room felt smaller with just the two of them inside. Irene had dismissed the nurses, asked Dr. Foster to give them privacy, and now sat on the examination table while Derek Sullivan stood near the door like a condemned man awaiting execution. The security guards waited outside, their shadows visible through the frosted glass. Sit down, Lieutenant Commander, Irene said, gesturing to the chair beside the examination table. Her voice was gentle now, lacking the authority she'd wielded moments before. Please. Sullivan sat, his movements mechanical. He couldn't look at her. Couldn't reconcile the soft-spoken medic he'd dismissed for months with the Rear Admiral who'd just dismantled his entire worldview in less than 5 minutes. I need to understand something, Irene began, carefully probing her ribs through her uniform. Nothing broken, she assessed with professional detachment. Bruised, certainly. Painful, absolutely. But she'd endured worse during SEAL training exercises that had left grown men crying. What made you think it was acceptable to strike me? Sullivan's jaw worked silently. How could he explain 8 months of frustration? The stagnation of his career, the younger officers being promoted over him, the constant feeling that he was being overlooked and undervalued? How could he admit that seeing someone even younger, even more junior, or so he'd thought, had triggered something dark and resentful inside him? I was angry, he finally said, the words inadequate and pathetic even to his own ears. At me specifically? Or at what I represented? The question cut too close to truths Sullivan didn't want to examine. I don't know. Irene nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that answer. She pulled up his medical file on the nearby tablet, scrolling through it with the same careful attention she'd shown during their confrontation. Your service record is exemplary, she noted. 14 years in the Navy. 3 deployments. Multiple commendations. You've served with distinction in some of the most challenging operational environments. And it hasn't mattered, Sullivan said bitterly, the words escaping before he could stop them. 14 years, and I watch officers half my age get promoted while I'm stuck in the same position, year after year. So you saw a young medic, someone you assumed was junior, inexperienced, insignificant, and something inside you snapped? Sullivan flinched at the accuracy of her assessment. When you kept pushing back, kept insisting. I felt disrespected. Like even someone as low-ranking as I thought you were felt entitled to challenge me. And that made you feel small, Irene said quietly. It wasn't a question. The words hit Sullivan like a second punch, this one aimed at his conscience rather than his body. Yes, he'd felt small. Diminished. Powerless. And he'd tried to reclaim power the only way his frustrated, angry mind could conceive, through violence against someone he believed couldn't fight back. I was wrong, he said, the admission scraping against his throat. About everything. About you, about what happened. I was wrong. Irene set down the tablet and met his eyes. You were wrong about more than my rank, Lieutenant Commander. You were wrong about how power works. Real authority doesn't come from intimidation or violence. It comes from competence, from integrity, from the respect you earn through your actions. She paused, her expression softening slightly. I've spent 8 months on this base being underestimated by nearly everyone. Do you know why? Sullivan shook his head. Because I needed to understand something that can't be learned from a position of obvious authority. I needed to see how people treat those they perceive as powerless. How they treat the medics, the junior enlisted, the people they think don't matter. Her voice grew quieter, more intense. And what I've learned, Lieutenant Commander, is that the true measure of a person isn't how they treat their superiors. It's how they treat those who can't fight back. The words hung between them like an indictment and an invitation. Sullivan realized that Irene Hill, Admiral Hill, was offering him something precious, the opportunity to understand not just what he'd done wrong, but why it mattered. The medic you struck today could have been anyone, Irene continued. Could have been a young sailor fresh from training, trying to prove herself in a world that already doubted her capabilities. Could have been someone barely holding together, one bad day away from breaking. You didn't just assault a superior officer. You assaulted someone who was trying to do her job with professionalism and competence, and you did it because you believed your frustration entitled you to violence. Sullivan's hands trembled in his lap. What happens now? Irene stood, moving carefully around her injured ribs. Now you have 48 hours to decide who you want to be. The officer who made one terrible mistake in a moment of anger. Or the man who's been making small, toxic choices for years and finally crossed a line he can't uncross. The base commander's conference room overlooked the Naples harbor, where gray warships sat at anchor like sleeping giants. Captain Elena Rodriguez stood at the head of the mahogany table, her expression carefully neutral as she reviewed the incident report. Admiral Catherine Reeves sat to her right. Irene occupied the chair to her left, her uniform crisp despite the tape binding her ribs beneath it. Derek Sullivan sat alone on the opposite side of the table, the physical distance a perfect metaphor for his isolation. This is an unprecedented situation, Captain Rodriguez began, her Mexican-American accent carrying the weight of 25 years in the Navy. In my 15 years as a base commander, I've never had to adjudicate an assault on a flag officer by a junior commissioned officer. She looked directly at Sullivan. Lieutenant Commander, do you understand the severity of what you've done? Yes, ma'am, Sullivan replied, his voice hoarse. He'd spent the last 48 hours in a state of suspended horror, replaying the moment his fist connected with Irene's ribs over and over in his mind. The sick realization that he'd assaulted an admiral. The deeper, more disturbing realization that he might have done the same thing regardless of her rank. Admiral Hill has requested that we approach this situation with what she terms restorative rather than purely punitive measures, Rodriguez continued. This is extraordinarily generous given the circumstances. Admiral Hill, would you like to explain your reasoning? Irene shifted in her chair, the movement causing a visible wince of pain. Captain Rodriguez, Admiral Reeves, I believe Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's actions, while inexcusable, stem from a larger systemic issue that we need to address. Over the past 8 months, operating under limited identification, I've observed patterns of behavior throughout this base that concern me deeply. She pulled up a presentation on the conference room's main screen. Charts and graphs appeared, showing data Irene had been quietly collecting for months. Medical staff reporting patterns show that junior personnel, particularly women, are 3 times more likely to have their clinical judgments questioned or overridden. Training exercise participation rates indicate that female sailors are consistently assigned to support roles regardless of qualifications. and incident reports reveal a troubling pattern of casual disrespect that rarely rises to the level of formal complaints but creates a toxic environment nonetheless. Admiral Reeves leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "You've been conducting an unofficial command climate assessment?" "I've been living it," Irene corrected gently. 8 months of being dismissed, talked over, having my medical expertise questioned by people with a fraction of my training. 8 months of watching capable sailors being sidelined because they don't fit someone's mental image of what a warrior looks like. She turned to Sullivan. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's assault on me was an extreme expression of attitudes I've observed throughout this command. He believed he could strike me because he'd internalized a hierarchy where some people simply matter less than others. Sullivan felt his face burn with shame, but he couldn't deny the accuracy of her words. How many times had he dismissed junior personnel? How many times had he assumed incompetence based on rank, age, or gender? Captain Rodriguez studied the data on the screen with growing concern. "You're suggesting that Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's actions are symptomatic of a broader cultural problem?" "I'm stating it as fact, Captain. The question is whether we treat this as an isolated incident requiring isolated punishment, or whether we use it as an opportunity to address systemic issues." Irene clicked to another slide showing proposed reforms: mandatory bias training, revised evaluation procedures, enhanced reporting mechanisms for disrespectful conduct. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan will face consequences for his actions. That's non-negotiable. But I'm proposing that those consequences include him becoming part of the solution rather than simply being removed from the equation. Admiral Reeves' expression was skeptical. "You want the man who assaulted you to participate in reforming base culture?" "I want the man who assaulted me to understand why he did it and to help ensure it never happens again to anyone else. Punishment alone doesn't create change, Admiral. Understanding does. Accountability does. Taking responsibility for not just this incident but for the attitudes that made it possible, that creates change." Sullivan listened with growing astonishment. Irene Hill wasn't just offering him mercy. She was offering him purpose. A way to transform the worst moment of his career into something meaningful. "What specifically are you proposing?" Rodriguez asked. "A 6-month program," Irene replied. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan receives a formal letter of reprimand and is reduced in rank to lieutenant. He's reassigned to work directly under my supervision in the medical department, where he'll experience firsthand what it's like to be on the receiving end of the attitudes he's demonstrated. He participates in developing and implementing the cultural reform initiatives. And at the end of 6 months, we evaluate whether he's demonstrated genuine change. And if he hasn't? Reeves pressed. Then he faces the full consequences, including possible court-martial and discharge. But if he has? Irene paused, meeting Sullivan's eyes across the table. If he has, then we've gained not just a rehabilitated officer, but someone who can speak authentically about transformation. Someone who can help other sailors recognize and change their own biases before they cross the same line. The room fell silent as Rodriguez and Reeves exchanged glances. 6 weeks into his reassignment, Derek Sullivan, now Lieutenant Derek Sullivan, the demotion official and humiliating, stood in the medical base supply room counting inventory. It was menial work, the kind of task he'd once considered beneath him. Now it was his entire existence. "Lieutenant Sullivan," Irene's voice came from the doorway. She'd recovered from the rib injury, though he noticed she still moved carefully sometimes. "When you're finished with inventory, I need you to assist with afternoon sit call." "Yes, ma'am," Sullivan replied automatically. The ma'am still caught in his throat sometimes. Not because Irene was a woman, he'd moved past that particular stupidity, but because every time he said it, he was reminded of the person he'd been 6 weeks ago. The person who'd looked at her and seen someone insignificant. The sit-call patients that afternoon included a young sailor named Emma Park, a 19-year-old radar technician who'd been experiencing chronic headaches. Sullivan watched as Irene conducted the examination with meticulous care, asking questions that seemed tangential but were clearly building toward something. "How's your sleep, Petty Officer Park?" Irene asked. "Fine, ma'am. I mean, I wake up sometimes, but that's normal, right? How often is sometimes? Park hesitated. Maybe 3 or 4 times a night? Sullivan saw Irene's expression shift slightly, not concern exactly, but intensified focus. She continued the examination, checking Park's vision, testing her reflexes, asking about dietary changes and stress levels. 20 minutes later, she'd identified what other medical staff had missed, early signs of increased intracranial pressure that required immediate further testing. After Park left with orders for emergency imaging, Sullivan couldn't contain his curiosity. How did you know? The other medics had seen her twice and just gave her migraine medication. Irene looked at him, and Sullivan saw something he'd never expected, a willingness to teach. Because I listened to what she wasn't saying. Park is junior enlisted, young, worried about seeming weak. She minimized her symptoms because she's been conditioned to not make waves. But the pattern she described, waking frequently, headaches worse in the morning, the slight hesitation in her left eye tracking, those were indicators that something more serious was happening. And if the other medics had listened better, they might have caught it sooner. But listening requires believing that what someone says matters. It requires treating a 19-year-old sailor with the same respect and attention you'd give an admiral. She paused meaningfully. It requires seeing people as inherently valuable, not just as positions on an org chart. The lesson landed like it was supposed to. Sullivan had spent 6 weeks learning to see, really see, the people around him. The junior sailors who worked 12-hour shifts and then studied for advancement exams. The petty officers who mentored new arrivals while managing their own families. The quiet competence and dedication that existed at every level of the command, invisible to anyone who only valued rank and authority. That evening, Sullivan attended his mandatory counseling session with Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, the base psychologist assigned to his rehabilitation. She was a Nigerian-American woman in her 50s with the kind of penetrating gaze that made lying impossible. "How are you feeling about the program?" she asked. Sullivan considered the question seriously. 6 weeks ago, he would have given whatever answer he thought was expected. Now, he tried for honesty. Humiliated. Grateful. Angry at myself. All of it at once. Tell me about the humiliation. Everyone knows what I did. Every person I work with knows I assaulted a superior officer. They watch me count supplies and assist with routine care, and they know it's because I couldn't control my temper. He paused. But the worst part isn't their judgment. It's that I deserve it. Every sideways glance, every whispered conversation that stops when I enter a room, I earned all of it. And the gratitude? Admiral Hill could have ended my career. Should have ended it. Instead, she's giving me an opportunity one don't deserve. Sullivan's voice grew rough with emotion. She's teaching me things I should have learned years ago. About respect, about seeing people as people. About how the way you treat those with less power than you defines who you are. Dr. Okonkwo made notes on her tablet. You mentioned anger at yourself. What specifically are you angry about? Everything. The assault, obviously. But also the years leading up to it. The times I dismissed junior personnel, talked over women in meetings, assumed incompetence based on rank or age. I was so focused on my own career frustrations that I became exactly the kind of officer I used to hate when I was junior enlisted. That's significant insight, Lieutenant. But insight alone doesn't create change. What are you doing differently now? Sullivan thought about Petty Officer Park, about the dozens of other sailors he'd interacted with over the past 6 weeks. I'm listening. Really listening. I'm questioning my assumptions. When I catch myself thinking someone is incompetent or insignificant, I stop and examine why I'm thinking that. He met Dr. Okonkwo's eyes. And I'm trying to remember that every person in this command has a story, has struggles, has value that exists independent of how useful they are to me. 3 months into Sullivan's rehabilitation program, Irene Hill stood before a packed auditorium of Naples base personnel. She'd shed her medical cover completely now, appearing in the service dress blues appropriate to her rank, the 2 stars on her shoulder boards catching the stage lights. But her message wasn't about rank or authority. It was about something far more fundamental. "I spent 8 months on this base being invisible," she began, her slight European accent carrying clearly through the sound system. "I was dismissed in meetings. I had my medical expertise questioned by people with a fraction of my training. I watched capable sailors being sidelined because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of what a warrior should look like." She paused, letting the words settle. "And I learned something crucial, that we are hemorrhaging talent and potential because we've created a culture where only certain kinds of people are seen as valuable." The audience, a mandatory all-hands call that included everyone from senior officers to the most junior sailors, sat in uncomfortable silence. Irene had insisted on this gathering as part of the base-wide cultural reform initiative. No one had been allowed to skip it, regardless of rank or position. "Some of you know about the incident that revealed my true identity. Lieutenant Sullivan, would you please stand?" In the 3rd row, Sullivan rose slowly. Every eye in the auditorium turned toward him. He'd known this moment was coming, Irene had prepared him for it, but that didn't make it easier. His face burned as hundreds of people stared at the officer who'd assaulted an admiral. "Lieutenant Sullivan made a terrible mistake," Irene continued. "He allowed his frustration and biases to manifest as violence against someone he believed couldn't fight back. But here's what I want you to understand. Lieutenant Sullivan's actions were an extreme expression of attitudes that exist throughout this command, throughout the military, throughout our society." She clicked to display the data she'd collected, the patterns of dismissal, the casual disrespect, the systematic sidelining of capable personnel. "Every time we talk over someone in a meeting, we're expressing the same fundamental disrespect. Every time we assume incompetence based on rank, gender, age, or appearance, we're manifesting the same bias. Every time we treat junior personnel as less worthy of dignity and respect, we're walking the same path that led to Lieutenant Sullivan striking me." Sullivan remained standing, feeling simultaneously exposed and strangely liberated. This was his penance and his purpose, to be the cautionary tale that might prevent others from making similar mistakes. "Over the past 3 months, Lieutenant Sullivan has been working directly with me," Irene said. "Learning to see people rather than positions. Learning to listen rather than assume. Learning that real strength isn't dominating those with less power, it's empowering them." She gestured for him to join her on stage. After a moment's hesitation, Sullivan climbed the steps. Standing beside Irene under the stage lights felt surreal. 3 months ago, she'd been someone he dismissed as insignificant. Now she was the person teaching him what it meant to be a decent human being. "Lieutenant Sullivan," Irene said, turning to face him. "Tell them what you've learned." Sullivan looked out at the sea of faces. He saw Dr. Foster, who'd spent months condescending to an officer far more qualified than himself. He saw the nurses who'd dismissed Irene's suggestions. He saw junior sailors who'd probably experienced their own versions of disrespect and dismissal. "I learned that I was a bully," he said, his voice rough but clear. "Not the obvious kind. I never yelled or threatened or, well, not until I did. But I was a bully in 1,000 small ways. Talking over people. Dismissing ideas without really hearing them. Assuming that anyone junior to me had nothing valuable to contribute." He paused, forcing himself to continue. "I learned that the way I treated people when I thought they didn't matter revealed who I really was. And I learned that the person I was, the person who could look at a dedicated medical professional and see only someone small enough to hit, that person needed to change fundamentally or leave the service." "And have you changed?" Irene asked. Sullivan met her eyes. "I'm trying to. Every day. But I also know that 3 months of trying doesn't erase years of toxic behavior. Real change isn't a destination, it's a continuous practice of choosing to see people's humanity, especially when it's inconvenient or challenging." Irene nodded and turned back to the audience. "This is what I'm asking from every person on this base. Not perfection. Not immediate transformation. But conscious, continuous effort to examine your biases, question your assumptions, and treat every person you encounter with the dignity they deserve. She clicked to a new slide showing the reform initiatives being implemented: bias training, revised evaluation procedures, enhanced reporting mechanisms. These are the structural changes we're making. But structure without culture is meaningless. We need every one of you to be part of creating an environment where talent is recognized regardless of where it comes from, where voices are heard regardless of how junior they are, where respect is extended to everyone, not just those with rank or status. The auditorium remained silent, hundreds of people processing what they'd heard. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single person began to clap. Others joined, the applause building until it filled the space. Sullivan, standing on stage beside the woman he'd assaulted, felt tears prickling his eyes. Not tears of relief or self-pity, but tears of recognition. Recognition that change was possible. That redemption, however difficult and uncertain, existed. 5 months into the program, Sullivan faced his most difficult test yet. A young sailor named Private First Class James Chen had been brought into the medical bay after collapsing during physical training. He was conscious but disoriented, his vital signs unstable. Dr. Foster was off base at a conference, leaving Irene as the senior medical officer on duty. "Lieutenant Sullivan," Irene called sharply as she worked to stabilize Chen. "I need you to prep in 4-line and pull his medical records. Move quickly." Sullivan's hands were steady as he prepared the equipment, but his mind was racing. Chen's symptoms, the confusion, the elevated heart rate, the tremors, looked disturbingly familiar. He'd seen something similar years ago during a deployment, a sailor who'd been hiding a serious medical condition out of fear it would end his career. "Admiral," Sullivan said carefully as he handed her the 4 supplies. "Permission to speak?" "Make it quick." "His symptoms, they're consistent with diabetic ketoacidosis. I knew a sailor in my previous command who presented exactly like this. He'd been hiding his diabetes because he was afraid of being medically discharged." Irene paused, her hands stilling for just a moment as she processed his observation. Then she turned to the computer, pulling up Chen's medical history with rapid keystrokes. No documented history of diabetes. But she scrolled through the records, her expression sharpening. He's been requesting sick call for excessive thirst and fatigue for the past 6 weeks. Each time he was told it was probably dehydration and poor sleep hygiene. Sullivan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Those symptoms should have been red flags. Someone should have investigated further. The medical staff dismissed him. "Because he's 19 years old and junior enlisted," Irene said quietly, already moving to draw blood for emergency testing. "Because the easiest explanation is often the one we default to, especially when we're not inclined to take someone seriously." She looked at Sullivan directly. "Thank you for speaking up. Your observation may have saved his life." Within 20 minutes, they had confirmation. Chen was indeed in diabetic ketoacidosis, a life-threatening condition that had been missed because multiple medical staff members hadn't taken his complaints seriously enough to investigate thoroughly. By the time Chen was stabilized and transferred to the hospital, Irene had already begun documenting everything that had gone wrong. That evening, she called a meeting of the medical bay staff. Sullivan stood at the back of the room, watching as Irene addressed the nurses and corpsmen who'd seen Chen over the past weeks. "Private First Class Chen almost died today," Irene began without preamble. "Not because we lack the medical knowledge to diagnose diabetes. Not because we don't have the proper equipment or procedures. He almost died because we didn't listen to him seriously enough to investigate his symptoms thoroughly. And I want each of you to ask yourselves why." The room was silent, uncomfortable. Finally, one of the senior nurses, Petty Officer Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran, spoke up. He'd been in 3 times in 6 weeks. At a certain point, you start to think someone's just looking for attention. "And why did you think that?" Irene pressed gently. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "I guess, he's young. I assumed he was just having trouble adjusting to military life, not managing his sleep properly. I've seen it 100 times. You've seen young sailors struggle with adjustment 100 times, Irene agreed. But how many of those times did you assume their struggles weren't serious because of their age or rank? How many times did you let your past experiences create a pattern that prevented you from seeing what was actually in front of you? Another nurse, Petty Officer Williams, raised his hand hesitantly. Are you saying we can't use our experience to inform our assessments? I'm saying your experience is valuable, but only when it's balanced with genuine openness to what each individual patient is telling you. Chen came to us 3 times reporting the same symptoms. Each time, he was dismissed with the medical equivalent of drink more water and get more sleep. None of us, and I include myself in this, took the time to truly investigate why a 19-year-old in good physical condition was experiencing persistent fatigue and thirst. Sullivan watched the faces around the room, the defensive expressions slowly giving way to uncomfortable recognition. These weren't bad people or incompetent medical professionals. They were competent staff who'd let their assumptions override their training, exactly as he'd done for years in his own way. Lieutenant Sullivan noticed what we all missed, Irene continued, and Sullivan felt every eye in the room turn toward him. Not because he's more qualified than any of you, he's not. But because he's spent 5 months learning to question his assumptions, to look beyond the easy explanations, to take people seriously regardless of their rank or status. She paused. I want each of you to spend this week reviewing your patient interactions. Ask yourselves whose symptoms you might have dismissed too quickly. Whose concerns you might have minimized because of assumptions about age, rank, gender, or simply because they'd been in before. And then I want you to think about how we change that pattern, because Private First Class Chen is alive today by luck as much as skill. Next time, we might not be so fortunate. The base gymnasium had been transformed into a training center for what Irene called conscious leadership development. It was month 6 of Sullivan's program, and the initiative had expanded beyond just the medical bay. Officers and enlisted personnel from across the base gathered weekly for workshops that challenged everything they thought they knew about leadership and respect. Sullivan stood at the front of the room beside Irene, his role having evolved from cautionary tale to active participant in teaching others. Today's session focused on cognitive bias in military decision-making, and he'd been asked to share his experience as a case study. 6 months ago, Sullivan began, facing a room of 50 personnel ranging from junior enlisted to senior officers. I was convinced I was a good leader. I had commendations, successful deployments, and the respect of my peers. But I was also systematically dismissing the contributions of anyone I perceived as junior or insignificant. I just didn't see it. He clicked to the first slide, a scenario based on his own experience. You're in a briefing. A junior sailor raises a concern about a proposed operation. Your immediate internal response is irritation. This person is slowing things down with unnecessary questions. What do you do? The room buzzed with discussion. Sullivan watched as people wrestled with the scenario, some defending the right to maintain efficient meetings, others arguing for the importance of hearing all perspectives. Here's what I would have done 6 months ago, Sullivan said. I would have acknowledged the concern with the minimum politeness required, then moved on quickly to what I considered more important input from senior personnel. I would have told myself I was being efficient, maintaining meeting discipline. What I was actually doing was signaling that some voices matter more than others. A lieutenant commander in the third row raised his hand. But some voices do matter more. Experience has value. We can't treat every opinion as equally valid. You're right that experience has value, Irene interjected, moving to stand beside Sullivan. But you're wrong that valuing experience means dismissing input from those with less of it. Some of the most significant tactical innovations in military history came from junior personnel who saw problems differently precisely because they lacked the experience that told them something was impossible. She clicked to a new slide showing historical examples, young officers whose unconventional ideas had saved lives, junior analysts whose observations had prevented disasters, enlisted personnel whose technical insights had revolutionized procedures. The question isn't whether experience matters. It's whether we're so attached to our experience that we become blind to new information. Sullivan took over again. For years, I confused dismissing people with maintaining standards. I told myself that not everyone's opinion mattered because some people simply weren't qualified to contribute meaningfully. But what I was really doing was protecting my own sense of authority. Because if a junior sailor could have valuable insights, what did that say about my value as a senior officer? The uncomfortable silence that followed told Sullivan his words had hit home. He'd learned over the past months that real change required people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, just as he'd been forced to do. "Let me show you something," Irene said, pulling up a new presentation. "These are the innovation proposals submitted by junior enlisted personnel on this base over the past 2 years. 73 proposals addressing everything from maintenance procedures to operational efficiency. Want to guess how many were seriously considered by command?" "Half," someone ventured. 7, Irene replied. "Less than 10%. The rest were dismissed at the first level of review, usually with variations of the existing procedure is fine or this isn't how we do things. Now look at this," she clicked to show a different set of data. "These are the same proposals, anonymized and resubmitted as if they came from senior officers. 41 of them were approved for implementation." The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. The data was damning, proof that good ideas were being dismissed not on merit but based on who proposed them. "This is what unconscious bias looks like in practice," Sullivan said. "It's not obvious prejudice. It's not conscious discrimination. It's the subtle, automatic assumptions that rank correlates with insight, that youth correlates with inexperience, that anyone who doesn't look or sound like us probably doesn't have valuable contributions to make." A senior chief in the back raised her hand. "So what's the solution? Are we supposed to treat every random suggestion from every junior sailor as brilliant?" "No," Irene replied. "You're supposed to evaluate every suggestion on its merits rather than on who suggested it. You're supposed to create an environment where people feel safe raising concerns and proposing ideas without fear of being dismissed or ridiculed. You're supposed to recognize that the sailor who's actually performing a procedure daily might notice inefficiencies that someone who only reviews reports would miss." Sullivan advanced to the next slide. "Here's what I'm doing differently now. When someone junior raises a point, I force myself to pause before responding. I ask myself, am I about to dismiss this because the idea isn't good, or because I'm uncomfortable that someone with less rank thought of it before I did?" That pause, that moment of self-examination, has changed everything. The session continued for another hour, with increasingly honest discussions about the ways unconscious bias affected military operations. People shared stories of being dismissed, of dismissing others, of recognizing their own blind spots. By the end, Sullivan felt cautiously optimistic that real change was beginning to take root. As the room emptied, a young lieutenant approached him hesitantly. "Sir, I just wanted to say, thank you for being willing to talk about this. I've been struggling with similar issues, and hearing someone admit they were wrong makes it easier to examine my own behavior." Sullivan felt something warm settle in his chest, not pride exactly, but something close to purpose. "Thank you for saying that, Lieutenant. We all have work to do. The key is being willing to do it." The end of the 6-month program approached with the weight of judgment. Sullivan's future hung in the balance. Would he be reinstated with his career salvageable, or would this be merely a prelude to discharge? The evaluation committee consisted of Captain Rodriguez, Admiral Reeves, and Irene herself, along with 2 officers from the Judge Advocate General's Corps who'd reviewed his case. Sullivan sat across the conference table, his service records spread before them. 6 months of performance reviews, psychological evaluations, and documented interactions with personnel at every level of the command. His fate distilled into folders and data points. "Lieutenant Sullivan," Captain Rodriguez began, "this committee has reviewed your performance over the past 6 months. Before we proceed with our evaluation, we'd like to hear from you directly. What have you learned?" Sullivan had prepared for this question, had rehearsed answers that would demonstrate growth and understanding. But sitting in that room, facing the people who held his career in their hands, he found himself abandoning the prepared speech. "I learned that I was dangerous," he said quietly. "Not because I was violent, though I was, but because I was convinced I was right. I spent years believing my frustrations were justified, my dismissals of others were reasonable, my assumptions about who mattered were accurate. And that certainty made me incapable of seeing the harm I was causing. He paused, gathering his thoughts. 6 months ago, if you'd asked me if I was biased against women or junior personnel, I would have denied it absolutely. I would have pointed to my service record, my professional relationships, my stated commitment to equal treatment. But Admiral Hill showed me that bias doesn't require conscious hatred or deliberate discrimination. It just requires the comfortable assumption that your perspective is the most valid one. Admiral Reeves leaned forward. And now? Do you still carry those biases? Yes, Sullivan admitted, and saw surprise flicker across several faces. But now I recognize them. I catch myself making assumptions and I question them. I feel the impulse to dismiss someone and I pause to examine why. I'm not cured of bias, I don't think anyone can be. But I'm aware of it now, and I'm actively working to counter it every day. One of the JAG officers spoke up. You assaulted a superior officer. That's a crime under the UCMJ that typically results in court-martial and discharge. Why should we make an exception for you? Sullivan met the officer's eyes directly. You shouldn't make an exception for me. You should make a decision about whether the past 6 months demonstrate genuine transformation or just skillful performance. If you believe I'm simply telling you what you want to hear, then I should face the full consequences. But if you believe I've actually changed, if the evidence shows I've become someone who might prevent others from making similar mistakes, then keeping me in the service serves a purpose beyond mercy. Irene spoke for the first time. I'd like to share some data. She pulled up a presentation showing metrics from the past 6 months, incident reports, climate survey responses, retention rates. Since implementing our cultural reform initiatives, we've seen a 23% decrease in formal complaints, a 15% increase in innovation proposals from junior personnel, and the highest retention rate for women and minority sailors in 5 years. These changes aren't solely attributable to Lieutenant Sullivan's participation, but his willingness to be public about his transformation has been a significant factor. She clicked to show testimonials from personnel who'd attended the training sessions. Sullivan read them with a mixture of humility and disbelief, people describing how his honesty had helped them recognize their own biases, how seeing someone admit and work to change had given them permission to do the same. Lieutenant Sullivan made an unforgivable mistake, Irene continued. But we're not here to forgive him. We're here to determine whether he's demonstrated the kind of fundamental change that serves the Navy's interests and values. Based on 6 months of direct observation, I believe he has. He's moved from being someone who perpetuated toxic culture to someone actively dismantling it. Captain Rodriguez consulted her notes. We've received evaluations from every department head you've worked with, Lieutenant Sullivan. Every single one describes significant positive change in your interactions with personnel. Dr. Foster, who initially requested your removal from medical services, now calls you one of the most effective advocates for junior staff he's worked with. Sullivan felt his throat tighten. Dr. Foster's approval meant more than he'd expected. The man who'd watched him at his worst now saw something worth endorsing. We've also reviewed the incident with Private First Class Chen, Admiral Reeves added. Your intervention potentially saved his life. The old Lieutenant Commander Sullivan would likely have missed what you caught because he wasn't trained to listen to junior personnel seriously. That's evidence of operational value, not just personal growth. The committee members exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Captain Rodriguez spoke. Lieutenant Sullivan, this committee has decided to recommend your reinstatement to the rank of Lieutenant Commander, effective in 30 days. You'll remain assigned to cultural reform initiatives under Admiral Hill's supervision for an additional 6 months. Your service record will permanently reflect both the assault charge and the subsequent rehabilitation program. This will likely affect your future promotion prospects, and some commands may be unwilling to accept you. Do you understand and accept these terms? Sullivan felt dizzy with relief and responsibility. Yes, ma'am. I understand and accept. Then let me be clear about something, Rodriguez continued, her voice hardening. This decision isn't mercy. It's a calculated investment in your demonstrated capacity to create positive change. If you revert to old patterns, if you fail to maintain the standards you've shown over these 6 months, the consequences will be immediate and severe. You've been given an extraordinary second chance. Don't waste it. I won't, ma'am. I promise you, I won't. 1 year after the assault, Irene Hill stood once again in the Naples base auditorium. But this time, the atmosphere was different, celebratory rather than confrontational. The base had just received the Navy's Excellence in Command Climate Award, recognition for the cultural transformation that had occurred over the past 12 months. Sullivan sat in the front row, wearing the lieutenant commander rank he'd recently been reinstated to. Beside him sat Private First Class James Chen, recovered from his diabetic crisis and now training as a medic himself. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, the man who'd nearly died because he wasn't taken seriously, sitting beside the man who'd learned to listen. A year ago, Irene began, this base was hemorrhaging talent. Good sailors were leaving because they didn't feel valued. Capable personnel were being sidelined because they didn't fit narrow definitions of what a leader should look like. Innovation was stagnating because we'd created a culture where only certain voices mattered. She paused, looking out at the assembled personnel. Today, we have the highest retention rate in the European theater. We've implemented 73 procedural improvements proposed by junior enlisted personnel. And we've become a model for other commands struggling with similar cultural challenges. She clicked to show a video montage of the changes, training sessions where senior officers learned from junior sailors, innovation workshops where rank was left at the door, mentorship programs that paired people across traditional hierarchies. The transformation was visible in the way people interacted, the confidence of junior personnel when speaking up, the openness of senior leaders to feedback. But the most significant change isn't captured in metrics or awards, Irene continued. It's captured in moments like this. She gestured toward Sullivan. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, would you join me? Sullivan walked to the stage, his movements steady despite the attention of hundreds of people. Standing beside Irene no longer felt surreal, it felt right, earned through months of hard work and honest self-examination. A year ago, this man assaulted me, Irene said bluntly. He let his frustration and bias manifest as violence. It was inexcusable, unforgivable, and should have ended his career. She turned to face him directly. But it didn't end his career because we made a choice, not to excuse what he did, but to examine what created the conditions for it to happen. And in doing so, we discovered that his actions were the extreme expression of attitudes that permeated this entire command. Sullivan took the microphone, his voice steady. I stand before you as proof that people can change, but also as a reminder of what happens when we don't examine our biases until they explode into something destructive. For years, I dismissed people I thought didn't matter. I talked over women in meetings. I ignored suggestions from junior personnel. I convinced myself these weren't problems, they were just efficient leadership. He paused, making eye contact with people throughout the auditorium. I was wrong. And my wrongness nearly destroyed both my career and someone else's life. He gestured toward Chen. 6 months into my rehabilitation, I helped save Private First Class Chen's life. But here's the thing, the old me would have missed what I caught that day. The old me wouldn't have listened seriously to a 19-year-old sailor's complaints about fatigue. The old me would have dismissed his concerns the same way others had, because I'd trained myself not to take junior personnel seriously. His voice grew more intense. That's what unconscious bias costs us, not just dignity and respect, but actual operational effectiveness. We miss crucial information because we've decided in advance that certain people aren't worth listening to. Irene stepped forward again. This past year has taught us that cultural change isn't about punishing individuals, it's about transforming systems. Yes, Lieutenant Commander Sullivan faced consequences for his actions. But more importantly, we all faced consequences by examining the attitudes and assumptions that made his actions possible. She clicked to show the final slide, a quote that had become the motto of their reform initiative: real strength isn't dominating those with less power. It's empowering them. That's the principle we've built this transformation on, Irene concluded. And it's the principle I challenge every one of you to carry forward, not just here but throughout your careers. Because the true measure of a military organization isn't how well we follow those above us, it's how well we lift up those beside us and behind us. The auditorium erupted in applause. As Irene and Sullivan left the stage, they were stopped by a steady stream of personnel wanting to share their own stories of transformation, biases recognized, assumptions questioned, relationships rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect rather than hierarchy. Later that evening, Irene and Sullivan stood on the overlook above Naples harbor, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean. The ships in port looked peaceful, their hulls painted gold by the dying light. "Thank you," Sullivan said quietly. "For seeing potential in me when I couldn't see it myself." Irene shook her head. "I didn't see potential, Lieutenant Commander. I saw necessity. The military needs people who understand both how easy it is to fall into toxic patterns and how hard it is to break out of them. We need people who can speak authentically about transformation because they've lived it. Still, you could have ended my career. Most people would have. Most people would have been wrong," Irene replied. "Because ending your career would have solved one problem while missing the larger issue. You were a symptom, not the disease. The disease was a culture that taught you those attitudes were acceptable as long as they didn't cross certain extreme lines." She turned to face him. "We needed to treat the disease, not just remove the symptom." Sullivan nodded, understanding the deeper truth. His assault had been horrific, but it had also been a catalyst, the crisis that forced an entire command to examine assumptions they'd been living with for years. "What happens next?" he asked. "After your assignment here ends?" "I take these lessons to other commands. Help them recognize their own blind spots before someone gets hurt." Irene smiled slightly. "And you continue the work here. Keep training, keep sharing your story, keep demonstrating that change is possible. Because that's how culture shifts, not through one dramatic moment, but through thousands of small choices to see people's humanity, especially when it's difficult." They stood in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon. A year ago, they'd been assailant and victim. Now they were something more complex, partners in a mission to transform not just individuals but entire systems, proof that even the worst moments could become catalysts for meaningful change. The naval base stretched out below them, full of people learning to listen, learning to question, learning to see beyond rank and appearance to the value that existed in every person who wore the uniform. It wasn't perfect, change never was. But it was better, measurably and meaningfully better, than it had been. And sometimes, Sullivan reflected, better was enough. Better was how transformation happened, not in dramatic revelation, but in daily commitment to doing the hard work of seeing people truly and treating them accordingly. He'd punched a medic in the ribs. 6 seconds later, he discovered she was a rear admiral. But the real discovery had taken much longer, the discovery that rank was irrelevant to dignity, that real leadership meant empowering others, and that the person he'd been wasn't the person he had to remain. The sun set completely, and the lights of Naples began to twinkle across the harbor. Sullivan and Irene turned away from the overlook and walked back toward the base, ready for whatever tomorrow's work would bring. The journey of transformation was never complete, but at least now they were walking it together, proof that even the most broken things could, with effort and grace, be remade into something better. 18 months after the assault, Sullivan found himself in an unexpected role, training officer for the Navy's new Command Climate and Inclusion program. The position had been created specifically for him, leveraging his unique perspective as someone who'd both perpetuated and worked to dismantle toxic culture. His latest assignment brought him to Naval Station Norfolk, where he'd been called to address a situation eerily familiar to his own past. A senior chief had been accused of systematically dismissing and belittling junior female sailors in his department. The case hadn't risen to physical violence, but the pattern of behavior was unmistakable. Sullivan sat across from Senior Chief Tom Brennan in a quiet conference room. Brennan was defensive, his arms crossed, his expression radiating resentment at being forced into this conversation. I don't know why I'm here, Brennan said flatly. I've never laid a hand on anyone. Never used discriminatory language. I treat everyone the same. Do you? Sullivan asked quietly. Let me tell you a story, Senior Chief. 2 years ago, I was convinced I was a good leader. I had commendations, successful deployments, the respect of my peers. I also had a pattern of dismissing people I deemed insignificant, I just couldn't see it. He pulled up his tablet, showing Brennan the same data Irene had once shown him, the patterns of who spoke in meetings, whose ideas were credited, whose concerns were investigated thoroughly. This is data from your department over the past year. Notice anything? Brennan studied the charts, his expression growing uncomfortable. Women speak less in meetings. So what? Maybe they just don't have as much to contribute. Or maybe they've learned that when they do speak, you cut them off, talk over them, or immediately redirect to male sailors' input. Maybe they've learned that their ideas get dismissed while identical suggestions from men get implemented. Maybe they've stopped trying because you've taught them their contributions don't matter. That's not, Brennan stopped, the denial dying on his lips as he stared at the data. You don't see it, Sullivan finished. I know. I didn't see it either. But here's what I learned the hard way, intention doesn't matter when the impact is harmful. You can believe you're treating everyone equally while systematically diminishing half your team. He told Brennan his own story then, not sparing himself, not softening the edges. The assault, the rehabilitation, the painful process of recognizing how years of seemingly minor choices had built towards something terrible. Brennan listened, his defensive posture gradually softening into something like recognition. I thought I was just being efficient, Brennan said finally. Keeping meetings on track, making quick decisions, not wasting time on every little suggestion. I told myself the same thing, Sullivan replied. But efficiency is just another word for dismissal when you're only efficient about silencing certain voices. Real efficiency comes from leveraging all your team's talent, not just the talent that looks and sounds familiar. They spent 3 hours together, going through Brennan's patterns, examining specific incidents, identifying the moments where assumptions had overridden evidence. By the end, Brennan looked exhausted, but something in his eyes had shifted, from defensiveness to uncomfortable awareness. What happens now? Brennan asked. Now you do the work, Sullivan said. You attend training. You examine your behavior. You apologize to the people you've harmed. You make different choices going forward. And most importantly, you accept that this isn't a one-time fix, it's a continuous practice of choosing to see people's value, especially when it challenges your assumptions. As Sullivan left Norfolk that evening, he received a message from Irene. She was in San Diego now, implementing similar reforms at another command. Her message was brief but meaningful. Heard about your session with Brennan. His CO says you got through to him. Keep doing the work. Sullivan smiled, typing back, learning from the best. How's San Diego treating you? Same problems, different coast, Irene replied. But the work matters. That's what keeps me going. Sullivan understood completely. The work did matter, not because it was easy or glamorous, but because every senior Chief Brennan they reached was dozens of junior sailors who might be heard, valued, respected. Every officer who learned to question their assumptions was countless people who might be judged on their merit rather than their demographics. He thought about the lieutenant commander he'd been 2 years ago, angry, frustrated, convinced his career stagnation was everyone's fault but his own. That man had been capable of violence because he'd spent years practicing smaller forms of dismissal. That man had needed to be broken down and rebuilt from the foundation. Sullivan didn't miss that version of himself. But he was grateful for the journey that had transformed him, painful as it had been. Because now, instead of perpetuating harm, he was preventing it. Instead of being part of the problem, he was helping create solutions. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from Private First Class Chen, now Petty Officer Chen, promoted and thriving in his medical career. Sir, just wanted you to know I helped train 3 new medics today on the importance of really listening to patients. Told them your story. Hope that's okay. Sullivan typed back quickly, more than okay. That's exactly why we share these stories, so others can learn without having to make the same mistakes. Proud of you, Petty Officer Chen. He looked out at the Norfolk harbor, where ships prepared for deployment, their decks full of sailors who deserved leaders committed to seeing their full humanity. The work was never finished, but every conversation like today's was progress. Every person who learned to recognize their biases was a step toward the military, and the world they all deserved. 3 years after the assault that changed everything, Irene Hill stood in the Pentagon briefing room, presenting the results of the Cultural Transformation Initiative to a room full of admirals and generals. The program she'd pioneered in Naples had spread to 27 commands across 3 continents, and the data told a story that was impossible to ignore. Retention rates have increased by an average of 18% in commands implementing these protocols, Irene explained, clicking through slides showing metrics from bases worldwide. Innovation proposals from junior personnel have tripled. Most significantly, reported incidents of harassment and discrimination have dropped by 42%. A Marine general raised his hand. Admiral Hill, these numbers are impressive. But I have to ask, is this sustainable? Or are we seeing temporary improvements driven by novelty and scrutiny? Fair question, General, Irene replied. That's why we've been tracking longitudinal data. Commands that implemented reforms 3 years ago continue to show sustained improvement. The key isn't one-time training or temporary policy changes, it's fundamental cultural transformation reinforced through continuous practice and accountability. She clicked to a new slide showing Sullivan's training program statistics. We've also found that personal testimony from those who've undergone genuine transformation is significantly more effective than traditional training. When people see someone honestly acknowledge their biases and demonstrate real change, it gives them permission to examine their own behavior. After the briefing, Irene walked through the Pentagon corridors with Admiral Reeves, who'd been instrumental in supporting the program's expansion. You've built something remarkable, Reeves said. Not just a training program, but a blueprint for cultural change that's being studied by military organizations worldwide. It wasn't just me, Irene replied. It took everyone willing to examine uncomfortable truths about themselves and their organizations. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, Petty Officer Chen, all the personnel who chose to be honest about their experiences rather than protecting the status quo. Speaking of Sullivan, Reeves said with a slight smile, I heard he's been recommended for the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal for his work with the training program. Irene nodded, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. 3 years ago, she'd been assaulted by a man who saw her as insignificant. Now that same man was receiving recognition for helping prevent others from making similar mistakes. It was proof that redemption was possible, that people could fundamentally change, but it would never erase what had happened. He's earned it, Irene said. Not because he assaulted me, but because of what he chose to do afterward. He could have served his punishment and returned to old patterns. Instead, he did the harder work of genuine transformation. That evening, Irene video-called Sullivan, who was in Pearl Harbor conducting training sessions. He looked older, tired but purposeful. The work aged people in ways that combat sometimes didn't. Heard you briefed the Pentagon today, Sullivan said. How'd it go? They're expanding the program to all naval commands globally. Your training protocols are being adopted as standard curriculum for leadership development. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago, I was facing court-martial and discharge. Now my methods for teaching people not to be like I was are being used throughout the Navy. It's surreal. It's earned, Irene corrected gently. You did the work, Lieutenant Commander. You continue doing the work every day. That matters. I got the medal recommendation, Sullivan said, his voice uncertain. Part of me thinks I should decline it. How can I accept recognition for cleaning up messes I helped create? You can accept it because the person you are now isn't the person you were then. And because other people need to see that transformation is possible and valuable. Your story, all of it, including the worst parts, saves lives by preventing others from walking the same path. They talked for another hour, comparing notes on their respective commands, sharing stories of sailors whose careers had been saved by cultural changes they'd helped implement. When they finally signed off, Irene sat in her quarters thinking about the strange journey they'd all taken. She'd come to Naples 3 years ago to conduct an undercover assessment of command climate. She'd expected to find problems, bias, discrimination, toxic leadership. What she hadn't expected was to become part of the solution through such a painful catalyst. The assault had been traumatic, inexcusable. But the transformation it sparked had rippled far beyond that single moment. Thousands of sailors now served in environments where their voices mattered regardless of rank or gender. Hundreds of leaders had examined and changed their behavior. Dozens of commands had fundamentally restructured how they valued and developed talent. And one man who'd made a terrible mistake had become an advocate for ensuring others never made the same choice. It wasn't redemption. Irene refused to frame it that way. Sullivan's transformation didn't erase his assault. But it was something perhaps more important, proof that people and systems could change, that awareness could lead to different choices, that even the worst moments could become catalysts for meaningful progress. Her phone buzzed with a message from Petty Officer Chen. "Ma'am, just got accepted to Officer Candidate School. Thank you for everything." Irene smiled, typing back congratulations. Chen's success, a young sailor who'd almost died because people didn't take him seriously, now rising through the ranks, was the real victory. Not medals or recognition, but lives changed and potential unlocked. She looked out her window at the Pentagon grounds, thinking about all the bases worldwide where sailors were learning to listen, to question assumptions, to see the humanity in everyone they served with. The work was never finished. There would always be more biases to recognize, more patterns to change, more people who needed to learn that real strength came from empowering others rather than dominating them. But tonight, 3 years after a punch that should have ended a career and instead transformed an organization, Irene Hill allowed herself to believe that progress was possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. And sometimes, that belief was enough to keep going. The Mediterranean sun that had witnessed her assault now set over a military that, however slowly and imperfectly, was learning to value every person who wore the uniform. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she started her undercover assessment. But it was, perhaps, the ending that mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.